You've been living in a pandemic, but not the one you think. Have you ever noticed how some people feel stuck? Like they are in a rut going around in circles, repeating the same things over and over again and going nowhere? They want to make changes in their lives, but they don't know how. They keep promising themselves each year that things are going to change, only to find themselves in the same place months later. You probably know someone like this, like a friend or a coworker or a family member, or maybe even yourself. There's no greater frustration of feeling stuck between where you are and where you need to go to unlock your potential. This phenomenon is a pandemic of the mind, and the cure is the wise mind. But what is the wise mind, you might ask? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today here on The Take with me, Tammy, the health coach. Hey y'all, welcome. We're here today to talk about the wise mind, and the wise mind is a concept talked about in dialectic behavioral therapy, or DBT. DBT uses a 3 states of mind model to describe a person's behaviors and thoughts. The 3 states are the emotional mind, the reasonable mind, and the wise mind. The emotional mind is driven by feelings, while the reasonable mind is driven by logic. The wise mind is a middle ground between the two that is a form of balance. Learning to use your wise mind can help you to better manage your behavior for better life outcomes. We'll explore the benefits and disadvantages of each state of mind right here, right now on The Take. So first up, we have the emotional mind. Expectedly, a person who is dominated by their emotional mind lets their feelings control their thoughts and behavior through emotional reasoning. And emotional reasoning is an unhelpful style of thinking where a person decides what is wrong or right based on their feelings. This includes their views, beliefs, and their conclusions about other people, situations, and even themselves. Emotional reasoning is basically a thinking error that can lead to cognitive distortions because feelings are mistaken for facts. This creates confusion because feelings are not facts, and people ruled by their emotional mind lack the self-awareness that allows them to step back and look at a situation, event, or person objectively. As you can imagine, there are a lot of disadvantages to being dominated by the emotional mind. One of those disadvantages is impulsive behavior. When a person is ruled by their emotions, it can lead to impulsive actions because they have not taken into account the consequences of their behavior. This type of person is lacking in forethought and foresight. And forethought is both consideration for the future and the ability to think or plan things out in advance, or premeditation. Foresight is the ability to look at events and predict the outcome, which is also called prudence. Emotionally minded people tend to lack foresight and forethought and act on their intense emotions, which they usually regret later. Other disadvantages to being dominated by the emotional mind are being vulnerable to manipulation, having strained relationships, and being emotionally overwhelmed. People who are openly emotional may find that others exploit their feelings to influence their actions or decisions, which typically leads to negative outcomes. Also, being overly emotional can strain relationships and can cause conflicts and misunderstandings due to sadness, anger, or jealousy. Being overly emotional can also lead to being overwhelmed, particularly in stressful situations, because a person's feelings can cloud their judgment and make it difficult to think clearly enough to make rational decisions. Additionally, a person being attuned to their emotions and those of other people can lead to emotional distress and being prone to worrying. There are also some advantages to the emotional mind with some caveats. Some of these advantages include enhanced empathy, increased creativity, and motivation and passion. Emotions are important when developing empathy. When a person is in touch with their feelings, it can make them more sensitive and may help them connect and build meaningful relationships. Emotions can also fuel creativity. Many creative types have used their emotional experiences to create something new and impactful. Emotions are also very powerful motivators. Feelings of excitement and passion can drive a person to vigorously pursue their goals and attain higher satisfaction in life. However, there are also some caveats as mentioned before. People who reap the benefits of the emotional mind tend to have some level of development. Those who are dominated by the emotional mind and are also in a state of arrested development, that is, being similarly minded to a child or a teenager while being an adult, tend to not have these benefits, but rather just the disadvantages like a lack of impulse control, a lack of foresight and forethought, strained relationships, and etc. For examples of people ruled by the emotional mind, we can look at 2 generic profiles, one male and one female. The generic male can be described as underdeveloped because he can't or refuses to do basic things for himself that he should be able to do as an adult. His behavior fits a user-abuser pattern. He avoids work, effort, adulthood, and manhood. He has an extreme sense of entitlement, and his relationships are always one way, such that he is always the beneficiary. He can be described as having lower vibrations and negative energy. He lacks empathy, basic decency, and a conscience. He also has the emotional range of a toddler, child, or adolescent. He is very selfish and can be described as a taker and not a giver. He lacks basic foresight and forethought and has manipulative and impulsive behavior that burns his bridges. His personality tends toward the dark triad of psychology: narcissism, Machiavellianism, and antisocial personality disorder. It's more common today that his type wants to be provided for, but still wants to be in charge because he's the man, quote unquote. This archetype of male is on a spectrum and is only a generalization, but at best, this type manages to be average at some times, and their best effort is always half-hearted. At the worst, this type is completely useless, and others would describe him as dead weight. He may even be prone to outright violence. His type is also extremely disloyal but demands unconditional love from others, especially women. He is lacking in actual masculinity, and so he is hypermasculine to try and hide this fact. He may also harbor hidden same-sex tendencies and usually has no positive male role model while growing up. Now, let's talk about the female profile, again a generalization of someone dominated by the emotional mind. This is a woman that can be described as desperate and misled by her feelings. Her past trauma clouds her judgment and leads to horrible romantic relationships. The bar for her standards is so low that it is basically in hell. She lacks self-love, but is usually able to achieve adulthood accomplishments like getting a job or an education. However, she allows instability into her life with her choice of male partners who are usually the underdeveloped type mentioned before. So she allows herself to be used and abused by men who have nothing to offer and who are basically dead weight, dragging her life down. This is because her only requirement is basically just being male. This means men with no redeeming qualities make the cut, even if they are not nice to her or violent or if they're criminals, because she is so damaged that she can't recognize the signs of disrespect or abuse. She also tends to lack a suitable positive male role model in her life. She's always trying to accommodate a male who is basically a bum. Her pattern of behavior can be described as male worship, male-centered, or male-identified, and etc. She accommodates the male to such an extent that it comes at a cost to her and anyone who associates with her, including her family, her children, her friends, and so on. For that reason, people shy away from her in the long run. At first, some people might feel sorry for her, but after seeing her go back to a bum over and over again, people get tired of her antics and they cut her out of their lives. In contrast to the emotional mind is the reasonable mind. A person who is dominated by the reasonable mind approaches a situation intellectually and makes their decisions based on actual facts via logical thinking. There are many advantages to using logical thinking, like better decision making, problem-solving skills, analytical skills, and critical thinking. Logical thinking allows a person to analyze information systematically to make decisions based on evidence rather than emotions. It also enables a person to break down complex problems into smaller, manageable parts to the point where they can identify root causes of problems and form effective solutions. A person using logical thinking can also identify patterns and draw meaningful conclusions based on data. Logical thinking also fosters an inquisitive mind that encourages a person to think critically and challenge assumptions. As you can imagine, a person dominated by the reasonable mind probably has better life outcomes than a person dominated by the emotional mind. However, there are drawbacks to relying solely on logical thinking. Some of these drawbacks include being emotionally disconnected, lacking creativity, ignoring context or nuances, and oversimplifying complex situations. When a person is overly logical, they may struggle to understand other people's emotions, which can strain relationships. Relying too much on logic can also stifle creativity and innovative thinking. These abilities require imagination and intuition, which are not logical. Being overly logical can also lead to context or nuances being overlooked when considering influencing factors for an outcome or decision. Relying too much on logic can also lead to oversimplifying complex problems that involve multiple variables. Such problems require flexible and creative thinking and are not something that can be neatly analyzed through just logic. A common example of a person who is dominated by the reasonable mind is someone who listens to those around them when it comes to choosing a career path. This type of person lets their teachers, parents, and friends influence what career they pursue. In general, the advice makes sense. However, in the long run, such a person may have some regrets that they didn't follow their intuition. This person probably feels stuck in a job that they don't like. They find little joy in what they have chosen to do for a living. They are ultimately unfulfilled, but they are also afraid to make a change because they've already invested so much time, effort, and money into their career. Jane Austen also presented a good example of the limitation of the reasonable mind in her novel Mansfieldpark. In the book, the character Fanny Price is the daughter of a woman from a wealthy family who married a man of lower status against her family's wishes. Fanny's mother was cut off and relegated to poverty. However, Fanny's wealthy relations on her mother's side of the family took pity on her and took her in when she was a child. Fanny grows up into an attractive, smart young woman, and her uncle sees the opportunity to attract a wealthy suitor for her. And that does come to pass when Mr. Henry Crawford proposes to her. Everything seems well and good, except Mr. Crawford has an obvious flaw in his character. We don't really want to get into into too much detail, but he's basically a womanizer that sleeps around. Mr. Crawford swears to Fanny that he has changed and that she is responsible for the change in him. Fanny's uncle, her benefactor who finances her life, allowing her to live in his house, encourages Fanny to accept Mr. Crawford's marriage proposal. At first, his insistence was out of kindness, but that soon came to anger and force. Fanny's uncle was only thinking with his logical mind. All that he could see was that a marriage to Mr. Crawford would be financially advantageous. Even so, Fanny refuses to marry Mr. Crawford. Her uncle berates her verbally in an attempt to intimidate her into submission, but Fanny doesn't budge. So Fanny's uncle decides to send Fanny home to her destitute parents in hopes that a lesson in abject poverty to persuade her to accept Mr. Crawford's proposal. Fanny agrees and returns home and sees her parents and her numerous siblings, many of which were not even born when she left to live with her aunts and uncle. The 1999 movie adaptation shows just how bad her situation is. We get to see how small and dirty Fanny's parents' house is, and we especially see the regret in Fanny's mother's facial expressions due to her own decision to marry for love to a man of low means. It is not a pleasant experience. We see the pests that plague the home, the lack of cleanliness, the cramped space made worse by a horde of dirty little kids running around, and the low quality of the food. We see immediately that Fanny's life has just grown much more uncomfortable. And that's not all. Mr. Crawford comes to visit her. He dazzles her and her family by showing his wealth. He does things like send her flowers and a fireworks display. Mr. Crawford's presence, as well as letters from Miss Crawford, Mr. Crawford's sister, who is still staying on Fanny's uncle's estate, are basically used to break Fanny down. The pressure of poverty and the manipulations from Miss Crawford work in an abusive way to get Fanny to agree to marry Mr. Crawford. So she finally accepts the marriage proposal, but in the night of the same day, she has a terrible nightmare. The next day, Fanny takes back what she said and insists that she cannot marry Mr. Crawford. Of course, Mr. Crawford loses his temper and leaves her there with her parents, and he says that he hopes she enjoys poverty for the rest of her life on his way out. Mr. Crawford is obviously a manipulator through and through, but eventually Fanny is vindicated concerning her decision when Mr. Crawford runs off with her cousin Mariah, who was already married to another wealthy man. Mr. Crawford refuses to marry Mariah after her husband turns her out and her reputation is ruined. This story by Jane Austen really does a good job of showing the importance of both emotions and logic. We see the poor outcome of just acting on emotions alone with Fanny's mother, who married below her station, but we also see that logic is not enough to base life decisions on. The moral of the story is that we also need to listen to our intuition and not just logic. In other words, we need to use the wise mind. So how do we negate the disadvantages of the emotional and reasonable minds while getting the most out of their advantages? The answer is the wise mind, the balance between the emotional and reasonable minds. While the emotional mind is described as the hot place, which is chaotic, erratic, exhausting, and unreliable, and the reasonable mind is described as the cool place, which is predictable, boring, limited in choices, and joyless, the wise mind is described as the knowing place, which is confident, mindful, balanced, and expansive in choices. The advantages of the wise mind are balanced decision making, reduced impulsivity, enhanced communication, improved emotional regulation, greater resilience, and increased self-awareness. The wise mind allows a person to navigate complicated situations with greater understanding and clarity. While the wise mind is the balance that we should all seek, there are some disadvantages of the wise mind. Those disadvantages include that the wise mind requires time and practice to be effective. It may lead to overthinking. It is not suitable for immediate action, and there are individual differences, and some people may require professional support to access their wise mind due to mental health issues. Despite these challenges with the wise mind, we here at Sambience BTG think that using the wise mind is a goal worth pursuing in our society. Just think about the last presidential election. Many people search Google for what is a tariff and can I change my vote after they had already voted. Those people voted on their emotions and personal biases instead of seeking to make an informed, balanced decision by actually looking at what both sides of the aisle had to offer. And now, tariffs are going into effect, government funding for certain programs is getting cut, people are losing their jobs, and so on. The point here is not to be the person to say, we told you so, but to say instead, we need to do better, so that we can have a more stable society instead of chaos. A good example of the wise mind is found in the book The Count of Monte Cristo by the famed author Alexandredumas. In the book, the main character Edmond Dantes faces adversity and ends up in a notorious prison, the Chateau d'If, in France, where the story takes place. When the story begins, things are going well for Edmond. He gets a promotion to captain of his ship where he was previously second mate. This means that he will have enough money to get married to his girlfriend Mercedes. However, things go awry when Edmond is handed a personal letter from the exiled Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte. The story is a bit more complicated, but Edmond accepts the letter in order to get medical treatment for the previous captain of his ship, who ended up dying anyway. When Edmond's ship returns to France, mysteriously his possession of Napoleon's letter is made known to the authorities, and Edmond is placed under arrest. At first, it seems that Edmond will be cleared of all charges and allowed about to go home, but at the last second, the mind of the prosecutor, Monsieur Villefort, is changed and Edmond is sent to Chateau d'If. While in prison, Edmond is beaten and subjected to horrible living conditions. Many years pass and it is obvious that Edmond has abandoned his faith in God and in any justice being done to him. Despite how hopeless Edmond becomes, he manages to make a friend when a fellow prisoner accidentally digs a tunnel into his cell. This other prisoner is a priest with a vast array of knowledge. He teaches Edmond to read, to write, the fundamentals of economics, and the sword. There was one scene in particular in the 2002 movie adaptation that really showed the use of the wise mind when Edmond is in the priest's prison cell and they are thinking over how Edmond ended up in prison when he really didn't commit any crime. They go over the information exchanged between Edmond and Monsieur Villefort during Edmond's interrogation before he was sent to prison. They go over every little detail until Edmond is able to piece together who betrayed him and why. And it's really interesting because the betrayal of Edmond is multifaceted and enacted by multiple people for different reasons. The first and obvious backstabber is Danglars, the first mate on Edmond's ship who was passed over for the promotion to captain. The second betrayer was Edmond's best friend Fernand Mondego, who coveted Edmond's girlfriend and wife to be Mercedes. The last conspirator, but probably the most instrumental backstabber, was Monsieur Villefort himself, who imprisoned Edmond in order to protect himself because the man who Napoleon's secret letter was to go to was in fact his own father. So Villefort was protecting himself from being marked a traitor. Edmond's reaction to finally figuring out how he was played by those around him is totally relatable. But what is extraordinary is how Edmond is able to escape from prison, locate a vast hidden treasure, rebrand himself as a count, and line his enemies up so that he can knock them down one by one. Seeing the story play out is really cool, but we're not suggesting that anyone go on a quest for revenge or anything. We're saying that we need to use the wise mind to ponder about the world around us so that we can better understand what is happening. So if an event happens to us, we can look back and wonder how did that event come to pass? And that information will help us decide what to do in the present and in the future. Just take Edmond for example. He didn't vote for some fake strong man to solve his problems. He started by using the wise mind to gain an understanding of what actually happened. Then he acted to solve his own problems based on that information. And that's what we want, for people to be independent thinkers who can act within reason to solve their own problems. Another example of the wise mind being used is in business. Conducting business is heavily dependent on data and analysis to make predictions and forecasts and so on so that business leaders can make confident decisions. However, there are times when the logical analysis that businesses depend on is no longer useful because a situation has come up that is entirely unknown. In these cases, a business leader cannot rely on data and analysis because there is none. To forge a path forward requires creativity. Decisions in such situations are essentially improvisation, but these decisions don't just come out of thin air. In the decision process, based on the context, a business leader will consider their knowledge, experience, values, and intuition to come up with a suitable solution. And that's what we need. Leaders who can create viable solutions and not a con man taking a wrecking ball to our democracy. And that's the take with me, Tammy, the health coach at Sambience BTG. We end every video with recommending that women get their US passports and/or passport cards. You never know when you might get the itch to travel, or it might be a godsend to spend some time outside of the US. Don't get caught off guard. Be prepared to travel by going to travel.state.gov and downloading Form DS-11, the US passport application. You can use the form filler online or just download the PDF. Don't waste time. Get your US passport today. And with that said, we're ready to go. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you later.